Sorry to interrupt this riveting content of you badly playing Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, but aren't you supposed to be making a video right now? A retrospective of all the prequel era novels you read in 2022? Meg? Meg?
What?
The retrospective?
Oh. So going into this 1999 to 2005, technically 2006, Prequels Era reread, I wasn't really sure what to expect because unlike the New Jedi Order novels, which I read in 2021, I didn't have a lot of memories of a good number of the stories here. I remembered back in the day viewing the prequel era novels as a way to get almost insider information into the movies that were going to be coming out. But in my reread, I found that that wasn't really the case. First of all, I have to say that for me, it's hard to separate the prequels movies from the prequels books because obviously so much of what happens in the books is contingent upon what happens in the films. And this may be a generational thing where if the first Star Wars you encountered was the prequels, maybe that's your absolute favorite Star Wars. But for me, the first Star Wars I encountered was the original trilogy and then those Bantam era novels that followed. So my favorite characters will always be the big four of Luke and Leia and Han and Lando. And while I remember in the moment wanting to know what was going to happen next, how the episodes were going to unfold, what was going to happen in the Clone Wars, it was never my favorite story. And so I think, especially with the novelizations, it's hard for me sometimes to judge the novelization on its own powers separate from the film that it's adapting, because with the films, so many of Lucas's decisions, when I watch them, I'm like, okay, huh? That's a choice. Many people have done this where they rewrite the prequels, they try to put their own spin on it, they try to make it less clunky. But again, that was part of what Lucas was aiming for. He really wanted it to have a different feel from the original trilogy, older, more mannered, and yes, politics heavy. I don't want to spend too long dwelling on what I would change about the prequels. I think my big one is that I wouldn't start with 9-year-old Anakin and 14-year-old Amidala. I think that with The Phantom Menace onwards, I would have shifted their ages upwards. Even Obi-Wan. I think that having Obi-Wan be 25 and then 38 by the time of Revenge of the Sith is much younger than I expected him to be. So that's my key fix. If I could only fix one thing in the prequels, I'd just shift everyone's age up by like 8 to 10 years. Make them a little older. And then maybe, okay, I said I'd only fix one thing, but now I have another one. I don't know. I would maybe make the Clone Wars last longer than 3 years. I know that wars can have a lasting effect on people's memories and history, and World War II was really only 6 years. But I would have maybe made it like 10. And then again, not had it quite so close to A New Hope, but then I do admit that that might have messed with the timing of Luke and Leia's birth. I'm not replotting the whole prequel trilogy, I'm just making a few personal changes here. And look, making tie-ins to films is difficult. It's hard to pull off because you really can't have essential information delivered through books that the majority of moviegoers are not going to read. Like, that's just not fair to the audience of the film to have something pivotal delivered through a novel that's aimed towards a much more select audience. So I think that the prequel era novels were walking a very difficult tightrope here, and while I don't think they stuck their landing 100% of the time, like, it's hard to do. I understand that. I had a lot of the same frustrations with the new canon books that came out in the lead up to The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, where I was reading the books because I wanted to learn important information. But because of the nature of how those films were made, that just wasn't the case. And that's definitely what I found here. What I appreciated from the novels was how they deepened my understanding of characters or events. Like in Labyrinth of Evil, giving us General Grievous's backstory, when in the 2D animated cartoon he just shows up. And then in Revenge of the Sith, we don't really get any explanation behind who he is or where he's come from beyond he's a pivotal separatist leader, and that's it. And so I think that's what I enjoyed about this reread, is getting to learn almost insider information that you don't need to watch the films, but that maybe deepened my understanding of the films in the end. But I felt like on the whole, the prequel era novels didn't tell as coherent a story as the New Jedi Order series did. And again, that's perfectly understandable. For the New Jedi Order series, they had almost like a planning group who planned out how the series was going to run from the beginning. And sure, there were changes along the way. The Agents of Chaos duology and the Edge of Victory duology became duologies because of changes in the publishing schedule. And we did see a little bit of that here, where the novel about Shaak Ti was canceled and Sean Stewart's story about Yoda was inserted instead. But again, I think they couldn't tell as coherent of a story here simply because of the nature of films. That George Lucas may have had a vision of how he wanted everything to go from the beginning, and certainly in his patented Lucas retconning way, he claims he did. But for the novelists, they basically didn't know what was going to happen in each subsequent film. We knew that Anakin was going to fall. We knew that Padme was going to have Luke and Leia. We knew that Obi-Wan was going to go into exile on Tatooine and Yoda on Dagobah, but that was really it. And except for some of the authors who wrote the prologues to episodes like The Approaching Storm or Labyrinth of Evil, they didn't really get access to the screenplays in advance either. I know that Terry Brooks, in writing the novelization of The Phantom Menace, got to talk to George Lucas and ask about things, but I'm not sure that R.A. Salvatore and Matthew Stover were allowed the same thing. So for me, at least, the prequel era novels then became a chance to learn about characters who, maybe are just cameo appearances in the films, but thanks to these novels, I grew to have a deeper understanding of. Like Barriss and the MedStar duology, which I thought were excellent books, and I loved getting to learn more about her and her very unique Force skills. And sure, Yoda Dark Rendezvous is mainly about Yoda because he's in the title, but I really enjoyed getting to meet Scout and Wee Malra because they were such interesting kids to read about. And actually, that's maybe where some of these prequel era novels fell short for me, that I suspected that maybe Lucas Books or Del Rey said, you have to include Anakin and Obi-Wan in a number of these. I'm especially thinking of Yoda Dark Rendezvous and Outbound Flight, even though I didn't always felt like they were integrated cleanly into the story, and in fact, their inclusion in the story somewhat took away from what I enjoyed so much about them, which was these other characters being allowed to develop and grow. And I think we can't talk about these prequel era novels without talking about Star Wars politics. It is a key part of the prequel trilogy. I guess it makes sense then that so many of these prequel novels, like Cloak of Deception and The Approaching Storm and Labyrinth of Evil and Darth Plagueis all involved political stuff, factions and scheming, and the way that Palpatine manipulated the environment and the feeling of the Republic as a whole. But I've said it before, I'll say it again. That's not my favorite parts of Star Wars. I think what I enjoy in Star Wars is the fantasy element, the mythological element, where it's a young man coming from nothing to save the entire galaxy. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, just stories of everyday people, like the X-Wing books, where we have Wedge Antilles, who appeared in the films, but then a whole lot of just normal people. Yes, they're fighter jocks, or in the case of the race, they're failures who rise above their past. And I just sometimes like seeing that side of it as well. Not just the mythological, but also the non-Force side. The side that normal people would encounter. And so the political stuff in the prequels loses me at times. If you loved that aspect of the movies, then I think these novels would be very interesting to you because so much of it involves that political stuff going on behind the scenes. But for me, if it's not an outright detriment, it's just not appealing to me. And I find it very interesting that in all these different novels, especially novels so focused on the political sphere, we're really missing out on Padme's viewpoint here. There is no Padme novel in the Legends books. We'll occasionally get her POV in some scenes like Yoda Dark Rendezvous or Labyrinth of Evil, but on the whole, what we learn about Padme either comes from the novelizations or from the children's books, like the episode 1 Padme Diary. And I really think that was a missed opportunity here to tell more of her story and maybe getting to see Padme's experience of, the invasion of Naboo and her time as a senator and fighting in the Clone Wars leading up to her death would have made the political aspect more interesting to me, just because this is someone that I wanted to learn more about, but she's just a minor character here. Despite being one of the big trio, we spend the least amount of time with her in the novels. And I felt too sometimes that depending upon the author's knowledge of what was to come with Anakin was sort of all over the place. In The Phantom Menace, all we know is that one day he'll become Darth Vader, but he's just this cute little kid. So it felt like, especially in those stories, the stories set in between The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, sometimes there was too much focus on the inherent darkness in Anakin. And I think it's one thing to point out his traumatic backstory, the ways in which, in taking him from his mother, the Jedi have adversely affected him. Even if, they're training him up to be something that he could have never been in slavery on Tatooine, it still leaves this damage and trauma behind. But I also think that stories like Rogue Planet or even the Jedi Quest books sometimes focus too much on how Anakin will fall, that he's too angry, he's too ready to choose the dark path. And I just can't see that sunny little 9-year-old boy in those depictions of him. And then too, I wish that, especially in the Clone Wars stories, we could have seen more of Anakin, the war hero. I felt like the Jedi Trial book, which was supposed to be about Anakin, really did him a disservice here because he doesn't really play a major role until more than halfway through the story. And I felt too that he became a Jedi Knight almost too late into the war. This is something that, of course, the 3D Clone Wars show retconned immediately. And I'm not sure how I feel about the retcon, but I think that knighting him 2 years or more into the conflict was too long because I would have loved to see more of Anakin's initiative. And I think I talked about this in my review of the Revenge of the Sith novelization, or maybe it was Attack of the Clones. But these novels really highlighted to me how the prequel trilogy has a villain problem. And that's not to say the villains are bad. The villains are very interesting here. There's just a lot of them. It's super rare that a villain will survive a film and make it into a next one. Really, all they can hope for is to be like Dooku, to survive one film and then die in the beginning of the next one. And maybe that's the nature of Palpatine, the nature of a Sith Lord. That there's always one person meddling behind the scenes, but that his minions will change, and he's willing to abandon them on the drop of a hat to achieve his goals. But what it felt like to me was that we have so much with Maul in the lead up to The Phantom Menace, but we don't learn much about Maul. And then what we do learn ends up being retconned pretty much by the 3D animated show. And then in the lead up to Attack of the Clones, we have Count Dooku, and no one knows he's an outright villain, but he is trying to convince planets to leave the Republic. Then, of course, within the Clone Wars, we have Asajj Ventress. We have Dirge in the 2D animated show, but I don't think he really makes any appearances in any of the books. And finally, we have General Grievous. And then going into Revenge of the Sith itself, we have Dooku, but he's killed. We have Grievous, but he's killed. And then Palpatine pretty much cleans up shop by having Vader kill the remaining Separatist leaders, so that going into that Dark Times inner trilogy period, we have Palpatine and Vader, and that's pretty much it. And this isn't a book problem, this is a movie problem, but I maybe would have liked a little bit more consistency with the villains here. Or if not consistency, at least not having them show up out of the blue, we don't know who they are. Because in the original trilogy, we have Vader through all 3 movies, and we get a hint of Emperor Palpatine in the second movie, and then definitely in the third. But it felt more in the prequels like all of the villains here, aside from Palpatine, are like Grand Moff Tarkin, and they have their moment of glory and then they pass away. And just personal preference, but that's not my favorite way to use villains. It reminds me of the Bantam era approach of almost the villain of the week, where every single story has a different villain, and it's always the New Republic fighting some remnant of the Empire, some local troublemaker, versus the New Jedi Order, where we have 19 books and the Yuuzhan Vong are pretty much the bad guys the entire time. And this is where I have to admit that while I wanted to read the Clone Wars comics, I did not get to them in this 2022 reread at all. Part of that was just time management. I had too much stuff going on to get around to them. And part of it was almost logistics, that I wasn't sure I wanted to run out and purchase those Marvel Essential collections because they're pretty pricey. But I was having difficulty getting them through interlibrary loan. I believe there's at least 4 volumes of those, and I could really only find 2, and I wasn't sure that the lending libraries were going to be able to fulfill those, so I just made the executive decision to not start them at all if I wasn't going to be able to finish them. And I would love to read those Clone Wars comics, maybe down the road some point. If I can acquire them all, I will. I'll come back and do them. Because I'd wondered if I was missing out on part of the story. The Clone Wars multimedia project was supposed to be exactly that. A complete story of the Clone Wars told through a variety of different kinds of media, from the 2D animated show, to the books, to short stories, to kids' books, to comics, to video games. And Dark Horse did a lot of Clone Wars comics, and I'm just sad I wasn't able to tackle them this go around. Do Do I wish that, especially for the Clone Wars multimedia project, that maybe there had been a story group working to map everything out so it didn't feel like a ton of one-off adventures? Yes, but that didn't happen. That's not what we got. But still, I'm glad I revisited these stories. I found that some of my old favorites still stood up for me, like Yoda Dark Rendezvous and Outbound Flight, and some that I hadn't revisited in a while really worked exceptionally well for me, especially MedStar Duology. I loved those so much. I think, too, in revisiting especially the Clone Wars books, it's so fascinating to me how Star Wars prides itself on continuity and they have a place for everything. But at the same time, Star Wars is constantly retconning things and undoing its own continuity. That we have things set in place within these Clone Wars stories that sometimes contradict each other. Not even to mention that by the time the 3D animated show rolls around in 2008, it's almost like they took what they liked of the existing Clone Wars stuff and then made up the rest. So if you're trying to do something like put everything in order, what fits where, it's hard, because do you go by the original chronology in which Anakin becomes a Jedi Knight more than 2 years into the war, or do you go by the updated chronology where he becomes a knight shortly after the Battle of Geonosis and then he has a Padawan that we've never heard about before? It's just one of the things I love about Star Wars is how it tries to find a place for everything, but just ends up inherently messy. Like, you have all these people working on things at the same time, and while they talk to each other and they try to get everything synced out, there's errors. I'm not even going to mention how I have tried to track down in the post-Return of the Jedi era stories when exactly the galaxy as a whole finds out that Luke and Leia were the children of Darth Vader, because there is no one answer for that. It's fluid from book to book. People will know and then people don't know. And so I think that's something you have to accept about Star Wars, that you can be a continuity nerd and you can find a place for everything, but you have to remember that something might come along and just roll a bowling ball down and screw everything up. And it's just the nature of Star Wars. I guess the nature of so many people working in the same sandbox. I understand now why comics are constantly rebooting, because otherwise, how do you keep track of everything? Other than Wikipedia, I guess. Besides the comics, were there anything that fell within this time frame that I didn't read? And the answer is that the only one was the first book in the Republic Commando series by Karen Traviss. It's not included in the list of Clone Wars novels, like there's 7 of them and it's not one, but it did fall during that 1999 to 2006 release period. The reason I did not read it was just because I sort of wanted to read the Republic Commando books in one go, to read all of the novels up through Order 66 and the 2 short stories together, which meant that they got pushed off to, I think, my 2024 schedule. This is very scary, but I have Legends books, like a reading plan all the way through the end of 2025. I hesitate to call it prequel novel reread part 2 because there's other stuff in there that's not set during the prequels, but I've tried to put a lot of it there, a lot of it together. So it's almost like, come back next year for part 2 of this, once we move further into Star Wars real world timeline, once the 3D animated show started in 2008 and things get rejiggered even more. So what ended up being my favorite Prequels Era rereads and which were my least favorite? Well, if you watch my reviews, I think it's pretty obvious which ones were my least favorites. Cestus Deception had such interesting ideas, but such uncomfortable execution for me, where I could see what Stephen Barnes was trying to do, but the end result just made me uncomfortable with a lot of what happened. I wish that Jedi Trial had been more about Anakin and less about original characters, because if you're trying to sell it to me as an Anakin story, it pretty much failed on that front. And it felt like not sloppy continuity, but like really badly shoehorned continuity, that having Anakin encounter Nisha Halcyon was just led to some of the most cringe-worthy scenes I have encountered in any of these novels. And it was so heavily reliant on military sci-fi tropes, and especially like planning and logistics, which are not one of my interests and really didn't work for me. I thought that Star Wars Galaxies: The Ruins of Dantooine was maybe the worst tie-in novel I've read thus far. It was written in a very short span of time, and it shows. And it felt more like fan fiction than something I would expect to be officially released by Lucas Books and Del Rey. I did not enjoy my reread of the Dark Nest trilogy. That was partially because I had to read it right after a natural disaster happened and my life was pretty crazy. And second, because I wouldn't say I'm an entomophobe, that I'm afraid of bugs, but I was afraid of the bugs in that book and it soured my enjoyment of it. But among my top reads, I loved getting to revisit Yoda Dark Rendezvous and Outbound Flight. I felt like the original characters there of Scout and Wee and Lorana Jinsler were the high points of those novels for me. I thought that Tatooine Ghost and Survivor's Quest were a lot of fun, and I liked getting to revisit the Bantam era with some of these added prequels revelations added in. And of the Clone Wars stories, my absolute favorites were the two MedStar duology books. I loved Barriss. I loved that whole cast of characters. I remembered enjoying those books when they first came out, but I really loved this like Star Wars take on MASH. I felt like I got swept up in the characters' journeys, and Barriss was an interesting Jedi, completely different from how her story plays out in the 3D animated show, but I think better for me because it's happier and she has unique Force abilities that we don't see with anyone else. And even though it came at the very end, I liked getting to read all those Clone Wars short stories, the majority of which appeared in Star Wars Insider. I only wish that we could have gotten more short stories because it felt like this reread was a little light on the ebook novellas. Although thinking back, we did get 4. We got a Maul one, we got the Obi-Wan adventure, we got Chewie saving his kidnapped son, and we got the stormtroopers that appeared in Survivor's Quest. So maybe it's just compared to all the stories we got in the New Jedi Order that I felt like it was lacking here, but actually in sheer quantity, there were more this time around than in my reread in 2021. I guess I just like the variety that comes from getting to read novellas and short stories, that it's not like having to crack open a novel every week. It's different viewpoints and lengths, and a little bit more variety in my reading experience. I do have to admit, though, to feeling a certain amount of disappointment in my reread this year. This isn't a job. I'm not doing these with a strict deadline in place. I'm mainly aiming to read 2 books a month. And when I started this in 2020, obviously there was a pandemic going on, and I wasn't going anywhere, and I wasn't doing anything, and I read 43 Star Wars novels in 1 year, which surprises me to this day. So perhaps it makes sense that by the time we get to 2022, I just have a lot more happening. I was in a play that was supposed to happen in 2020 and finally happened 2 years later. My sister got married. I got COVID. I was in another play. A natural disaster happened, and I don't know what I was thinking, but I signed up to do another play, and that's going to be running for a month in January and February. So I think maybe in the end I was too harsh on myself, that I still achieved what I set out to do. I still read and reviewed 2 Star Wars books a month, but there was more I wanted to do. I had some video essay ideas that fell by the wayside. My Clone Wars short story review was meant to happen at the end of the Clone Wars novels, but didn't happen until the very end here. And so I think going into 2023, I want to give myself a little more personal grace, that I still want to do 2 reviews a month. But all that extra stuff, I'm not going to beat myself up if that doesn't happen. So I enjoyed revisiting the prequel era novels that were released between 1999 and 2006. I hope you enjoyed my reviews, even my contentious ones, and I'm looking forward to February when I'll be starting the post-New Jedi Order books with Legacy of the Force, Betrayal by Aaron Alston.